Good afternoon, everybody. It's not a very nice day, but I hope you're managing to keep in good spirits as things get even more difficult for us. Last week we were talking about what is necessary in the sense of trying to plan or think about where we are and where we might be, both in the church and in our life of faith, the Lord, and in modern society. And we spoke about the need for patient reflection and not hastily opinionated sound bites or selective listening where we just pick out the bits that are part of our agenda. We talked about how we reacted to our failure to control our destiny and how often this made us angry and complaining and also willing to swallow anything. And finally, we said that the need is to open our minds and hearts to see the truth about our situation and somehow be dismantled from all our pride and arrogance so that we can live it together. When you're watching this afternoon, Mr. Joe Biden will have become the 46th President of the United States. A lot of people are really looking forward to it after 4 years of truly dreadful leadership. And the poor man, the hopes of the nation, the hopes of the world are laid upon his aging shoulders. But he is a decent man, a man of wisdom, of political experience, and we hope and pray that as a result of his presidency, things will improve not only for the United States, but for relations with the rest of the world. I'm interested to see that the first two things he wishes to do before the end of today is to sign up once again to the Paris Agreement of 2015 on climate control and also rejoin the World Health Organization. All of that is very encouraging. But will people let him change things? And what should a president do? Certainly, a president is not there to control or dominate people, but somehow to gather them together, to oversee them like a person in charge of a meeting, to gather them together, to oversee them, but to bring them together and to bring them with him. He is not meant to be a demagogue or a populist pushing his own agenda and ideology. And it's interesting to reflect at this point on what we understand the word president to mean in church terms. Now, I, as your priest, preside at the liturgy, but the liturgy is about all of us. It's not about the president, it's about all of us. And in the early days of the church, there were no priests, no bishops, only deacons and elders. And when the Eucharist was celebrated in people's homes, it was the senior member of that family who presided at the liturgy, to the point that St. Paul, in his first letter to Timothy, left some very specific instructions for the president, and I'll read them to you. To want to be a presiding elder is to want to do a noble work. That is why the president must have an impeccable character. He must be temperate, discreet, and courteous, hospitable, and a good teacher, not a heavy drinker, nor hot-tempered, but kind and peaceable. He must not be a lover of money. It is also necessary that people outside the church should speak well of him, so that he never gets a bad reputation or falls into the devil's trap. So there you are, Mr. Biden. That's for you. And we know that Donald Trump has now gone. But what has come to be called Trumpism hasn't. The falsehoods, the lies, the fake news, the alternative facts, which have now they've sort of entered our psyche to the point that we almost take it for granted that no one's telling you the truth. And it doesn't seem to disturb us that much, which it should. we have been peddled an illusion: make America great again. Well, it isn't a great nation. No nation's a great nation. We call ourselves Great Britain, and we're not. But this hugely inward-looking approach, which simply denied anything outside or anything that was not in its interest, and tried to scare people, is what's brought the United States to where they are. The last image we have of Mr. Trump in power is standing by the famous 450-mile wall that he had constructed between Mexico and the United States to keep people out. And he wanted to show clearly a physical legacy as much as anything else. But think back, if you will, think back. The Mayor of London wrote a piece in one of the papers of the day about ideologies and about how this form of populism, of appealing to people's baser needs and fears and, proposing a certainty and almost arrogance that would take them all away, was the basis for the development of the Third Reich under Adolf Hitler and of communism. And indeed, it is the basis for, even more worrying, certain populist governments in the present moment in Brazil, in India, in Turkey, in Hungary, and very many African nations. This has not gone away. Somehow it is about us and appealing to something that is in us. And I remember when I was a boy, when you played and you acted things out, there was always goodies and baddies, weren't there? Cowboys and Indians, Brits and Germans. The Indians always lost, the Germans always lost. And we would act out this thing in our playing when we were young children, as if it was something new, but the goodies always won, and we were always the goodies. So the cowboys and Indians, the Indians never got a look in. They were always the baddies. And this was obviously something that we had seen in our cinema and the television in its early days, and in sort of literature. It was only films like Dances with Wolves and the great outlaw Josie Wales which showed us a positive side to the Indian nation and began to make us think again about what it meant. And the same applied to black slaves and even black people. They were somehow portrayed as the baddies, and we were always the goodies, and the goodies always won, and the goodies were never wrong. And so that thinking is still present, even in a lot of American TV films and drama. There's goodies and baddies, and you watch it. I watch it most nights, one thing just to sort of fall asleep to, really. But underneath it all is, our country is great, nothing must change our attitude, and there's all these horrible people out there trying to undermine our democracy. And it's the same here. You see the sinister sort of spy dramas and things like that. I still think James Bond was the best because he sent it all up, but there's this kind of huge, national security and classified, and it's all very, all very sort of secretive and already keep these evil people out. But there is a fallacy here. There's a fallacy here when we are pointing the finger at other people. There's a lovely priest in Ireland called Father Brian Darcy, and he is a Passionist father who has been disciplined by Rome many times, and he's a broadcaster. He writes for a national Irish paper, and at the weekend there was an article he wrote that I want to quote from because it is very relevant here. At the moment in Ireland, there's a huge scandal about what was called the mother and baby homes of the 1950s and 60s, where pregnant girls would be taken or sent and have their babies, and the babies would be taken away and adopted. Some of the babies died and 9,000 of them disappeared. Many of these homes were run by the church, supported by the state. Others were run by the state itself. And one has to say in their defence that much of this was out of compassion for a young girl who somehow got pregnant. The person who got her pregnant never suffered, but she was made to feel evil and a shame on the family, so had to be somehow removed and endured from some of the religious, sadly, a very cruel thing that has left a mark upon them. And this has all now come to light in the last few weeks with a report on these mother and baby homes. And so Father Brian wrote in his piece at the weekend, "This past week we have pointed an accusing finger at many institutional targets, which is entirely understandable. However, it may not be healthy dumping the blame on nuns, priests, doctors, and snobbish parents. Yes, they were guilty, but they were not the only architects of that cruel, oppressed, hyper-moralistic society. The Church, especially the Catholic Church, must accept much of the blame, but so too must politicians, journalists, the Gardaí, the medical profession, and every one of us who hadn't the guts or the wisdom to shout, 'Stop.' Every generation preaches enthusiastically about the culpable ignorance of previous generations. It helps us to blind ourselves to our own failings. Preaching morality is a lot easier than acting morally." And so he went on to say that the American Republicans have allowed Donald Trump to hijack their party, and no one shouted stop to him. Some Catholics have remained silent, even when the worst elements of this came along in the last 2 weeks, including some bishops, priests, a few sisters, and right-wing Catholic media. And it is interesting to know that 50% of the Catholics in the United States voted for Trump, and 74 million Americans voted for him. Many years ago in the Tablet, there was a columnist called John Harriet, and he used to write some very interesting and stimulating pieces. And one of those things that I always remember on this particular matter of eyeing the blight on someone else and pointing the finger of blame, he said, "We are all party to the errors. We are all party to the follies that we mock, all guilty of the errors we condemn." We are the ones who point the finger at others, but actually we are the ones who are guilty ourselves because we blind ourselves to it. And that's true, obviously, in the Irish Church at present, but also here and in our politics, in our religion, in our society. We are very good at complaining, aren't we? We said this last week. Complaining about the NHS, complaining about this. Why haven't we got these vaccines? Why haven't we got this? And pointing the finger at somebody else. And it closes our eyes. And as a society, we have closed our eyes in this Great Britain to some very, very unsavoury things. We have closed our eyes to the 217,000 members of the British public who were murdered legally last year. That should normally cause a huge storm, but the fact that they didn't actually get to be born doesn't matter, because they're not really people. We have closed our eyes to the activities of the Home Office, deporting people who've been living here for 50 years, or keeping refugees out and sending them back elsewhere. creating a huge bureaucracy where people who run away from murder and mayhem for their own lives can't settle and receive asylum, which means safety in this country. We've closed our eyes to the fact that £7 billion is made every year by selling weapons of destruction to the Saudis, which regime is extremely unstable. So we've closed our eyes to these things. That's where we're guilty. We've closed our eyes to so many things, as indeed the American people have. If it's in your interests, then that is what is paramount. And then there are the COVID deniers and people who go around saying, ban the lockdown. The BBC, which is not always the most creditable organisation, has partly redeemed itself recently. And this morning on Breakfast Television, there was an in-depth investigation into hospital wards. It showed hospitals in London, in Birmingham and other parts of the country, which were totally and utterly overloaded. It showed the nurses crying with pain. It showed the mortician bringing 100 bodies into the mortuary, all wrapped up in a white plastic bag, which can never be opened, to the point that relatives can never see them again. And it brought to light the strain of what is going on in the front line, of which many of us were unaware or chose to look away because we were too angry that things weren't happening that we thought should be. We have to face facts. We also have to face the unpleasant things about ourselves, as indeed the American people do. So we pray for President Biden today, that not only that he can do what needs to be done for the United States and also for the rest of us, but also, more importantly, that he gets the support to do what he needs to do, to heal, to bring back some sense of sanity to a country that has completely and utterly lost its way. But for that to happen, there have to be people who are willing to change their minds, to face the truth, and face up to their own culpability. That's the secret. It's not about Joe Biden. It's about American people, and to an extent, this is about all of us. We have to face up to our culpability every day. Otherwise, nothing will ever change for the good.